I rise today to speak about the Supreme Court's ruling this morning in the case involving the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate. In that case, the Supreme Court rendered a decision that may be spun by many, perceived by many as a victory for the proponents of the controversial individual mandate contained within the Affordable Care Act. I submit today, however, Madam President, that this victory, if it is to be called that, will prove to be not only hollow, but also short-lived. I say that because, significantly, the Supreme Court was able to uphold the constitutionality of the mandate only by a series of gymnastics that allowed the court to find that this was a tax. First, the court addressed the issue and concluded, for only the third time in the last 75 years, only the third time since 1937, that Congress had in fact exceeded its power as asserted under the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Having concluded that Congress lacks the authority to compel commerce, the creation of commerce, so that it could then regulate commerce, the Supreme Court went on to shoehorn this individual mandate provision into the Supreme Court's conception of Congress's taxing power. This awkward construction is one that exposes many of the true flaws of the individual mandate. The mandate itself, we must remember, was not wildly popular among the American people at the time it was enacted. It has become even less popular as the American people have come to understand it. A recent poll revealed that roughly 74% of Americans don't like the individual mandate. This is easy for us to understand when we think about the fact that we as Americans were born as a free people. We were intended to live as a free people. It offends our most basic sense of freedom to have one of the most personal decisions made for us by government, particularly by the impersonal, distant government that's based in Washington, D.C. These kinds of decisions should be made by individuals and families in consultation with their doctors, not by government bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. So the fact that it's unpopular doesn't surprise us. And given the fact that the Supreme Court was able to uphold the individual mandate only by calling it a tax is very significant. It's especially significant given the fact that it was pitched to the American people as something other than a tax. The president promised us he would not raise our taxes. He promised us that the individual mandate did not amount to a tax increase. He promised us all along that he would never raise the taxes of any American earning less than $250,000 a year. Well, those who participated in Congress, who voted for this provision, also promised us that this would not amount to a tax increase. They did so for one simple reason. They knew it couldn't pass. They knew it wouldn't be able to get the number of votes necessary to make it become law if they called it a tax. So they didn't. They went to great lengths to make sure that it wasn't described or characterized or structured as a tax within the text of the statute itself. Now, after the fact, the Supreme Court has taken the step of shoehorning this regulation into Congress's taxing authority, and it's calling it a tax, effectively insulating those members of Congress who voted for it from the political liability attached to having voted for a tax increase. Not just any tax increase, but a tax increase that the Joint Committee on Taxation has concluded will be borne overwhelmingly by hardworking middle-income earners. In fact, they've concluded that over 75% of the burden associated with this thing that has now been deemed a tax will be paid by those earning less than $250,000 a year. It was unpopular before we were told it would be deemed a tax. Now that it's a tax, we can't expect that its status as a tax will enhance its popularity. If anything, we can expect that it will become even less popular with the American people. For that reason, I'm absolutely convinced that for those who call this a victory for the individual mandate, it will prove to be anything but a victory. It will prove to be something that will result in a groundswell of people contacting their members of Congress, telling them that they don't want their taxes raised, telling them that members of Congress who voted for this promised them that it wouldn't be a tax increase, asking them, for instance, to vote on it, to decide once and for all whether they're willing now to call it a tax, given that that was the only way in which it could be affirmed, upheld as a valid constitutional exercise of Congress's power. Now, as we move forward to the November elections, we're going to hear a lot about what people don't want out of their national government. We'll continue to hear a lot from those people who are offended by this notion that the government can tell them where to go to the doctor and how to pay for it, who are offended by the notion that government would step in and tell Americans, you have to buy health insurance, not just any health insurance, but that health insurance which Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has deemed necessary for every American to purchase. And if you don't, you're going to be penalized. If you don't, you're going to be taxed. People are going to be upset about this. They're going to complain to Congress and to candidates for Congress. They're going to complain to the president and to other candidates for the presidency that this is not the kind of government that they want. After they do that, they'll proceed and they'll start talking about what kind of government they do want. That's where we have to move, away from the kind of government we don't want, toward the kind of government that we do want. The kind of government that we do want is today, in so many respects, the same kind of government that we as Americans have always wanted, ever since our founding. That is a government that at the national level recognizes limits to its power, recognizes that whenever government acts, it does so at the expense of our individual liberty. And when the federal government acts to a significant degree, it does so at the expense of our state governments, governments which are closer to the people and often more responsive to the needs and to the evolving demands of the people. This is not simply a technicality upon which we are involved in a discussion. This is a very important part of the political process. It's essential that anytime we raise taxes, we do so in a way that is clear to the people, that we stand accountable for raising taxes to the people. The courts don't have the expertise to do that, and yet they exercise that power today. As the majority opinion today reminded, the Supreme Court of the United States possesses neither the expertise nor the prerogative to make policy judgments. Those decisions are entrusted to our nation's elected leaders, who can be thrown out of office if the people disagree with them. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from our country's greatest founding father, George Washington, who said something very similar way back in 1789, when he explained, "The power under the Constitution will always be in the people. It is entrusted for certain defined purposes and for a limited period to the representatives of their own choosing. And whenever it is executed contrary to their interest or not agreeable to their wishes, their servants can and undoubtedly will be recalled." This reminds us of the fact that we as Americans are in control of our own destiny as a nation. We as Americans are here and have the prerogative to explain what we want and what we don't want out of our government. The government exists to serve the people and not the other way around. The decision rendered by the Supreme Court today, while something that I disagree with in many respects, is one that I predict will usher in a new era of robust debate and discussion over issues of federalism and individual freedom. That debate, I'm convinced, will lead inexorably to the result that we as Americans will become more free, less captive to a government that tells us where to go to the doctor and how to pay for it, that we as a people will again prosper as we regain our God-given right to constitutionally limited government. Thank you, Madam President.